Nui Dat, South Vietnam. February 1968. American Captain Daniel Morrison stood in the Australian Task Force briefing room staring at a map that showed something he'd never seen before. Two SAS squadrons operating in the same province, Australian SASR and New Zealand SAS, together. The briefing officer, an Australian major, was explaining the operational concept. Starting next week, we'll have Australian and Kiwi SAS patrols coordinating reconnaissance operations across Viet Cong province, shared intelligence, coordinated ambushes, combined tactical planning. Morrison raised his hand. Major, with respect, isn't that redundant? You're putting two SAS units in the same operational area. Seems like overkill. The Australian major smiled. Captain, you're absolutely right. It is overkill, that's the point. Morrison didn't understand. Not yet. He'd been in Vietnam for 8 months. He'd seen Australian SAS operate. He knew they were good, maybe the best reconnaissance force in the country. But two SAS units. That seemed like tactical luxury in a war where troops were spread thin, and every unit had more area to cover than they could handle. Then the major showed casualty projections. Viet Cong forces in Viet Cong province, estimated 1,500 fighters. Combined Australian-New Zealand SAS strength, 160 soldiers. Projected enemy casualties over 6 months, 400-600 killed. Projected Allied casualties, fewer than 5. Morrison looked at the numbers again, certain there was a mistake. Sir, those numbers can't be right. You're projecting a 1 kill ratio against an entrenched enemy in terrain they control. Conservative estimate, the major replied, based on what Australian SAS achieved alone last year. Add New Zealand SAS with identical training, identical tactics and coordination between patrols. We think 100. 1 is conservative. Morrison thought the major was delusional. Confident to the point of arrogance. No unit achieved those kinds of results against experienced guerrillas in jungle terrain. 6 months later, Morrison would write in his after-action report, initial assessment of combined ANZAC SAS operations was that projections were overly optimistic. Actual results, 492 enemy confirmed killed. Original projections were not optimistic, they were accurate. This level of tactical dominance by small unit forces is unprecedented in my experience. What happened when New Zealand SAS joined Australian SAS in Vietnam wasn't just successful Allied cooperation. It was the creation of a combined reconnaissance and direct action capability so effective that enemy forces couldn't counter it. American commanders couldn't believe it. And even the SAS soldiers involved were surprised by how well it worked. This is the story of the alliance that wasn't just an alliance, but a tactical revolution. When two nations who shared training, culture, and operational philosophy combined forces and created something more effective than the sum of its parts. Don't click away, because you're about to discover why combining Australian and New Zealand SAS didn't just double their effectiveness, it multiplied it. You're about to hear from the soldiers who operated together, the commanders who coordinated them, the enemy who faced them, and the Americans who watched in disbelief as ANZAC Special Forces rewrote the rules of small unit operations in Vietnam. This is the story of when good got paired with good and created unstoppable. The decision to deploy New Zealand SAS to Vietnam in 1968 came from political and military calculations that had nothing to do with tactical innovation. New Zealand, like Australia, had committed forces to support American operations in Vietnam as part of ANZUS alliance obligations. By 1967, New Zealand had an artillery battery and infantry company in country, but faced domestic political pressure to either increase commitment or withdraw entirely. The compromise was deploying a small, elite force that would have disproportionate impact: the New Zealand Special Air Service. The NZSAS and Australian SASR shared an institutional lineage. Both were modeled on the British SAS, established in the 1950s and developed through counterinsurgency operations in Malaya and Borneo. Officers and NCOs regularly exchanged between the units for training and operations. The selection courses were nearly identical: 6 months of physical and psychological testing designed to identify soldiers with mental endurance, tactical judgment, and refusal to quit. When New Zealand decided to deploy SAS to Vietnam, the operational question wasn't whether they'd be effective, but how to employ them for maximum impact given their small numbers. The initial plan was to attach NZSAS troops to Australian SAS squadrons as individual augmentation. New Zealand would provide trained soldiers. Australia would provide command structure and logistics. Everyone would benefit from increased patrol capacity. But when the first NZSAS troop arrived at Nui Dat in January 1968, and Australian SAS commanders saw what they were working with, the plan changed immediately. We realized within the first week that we weren't getting augmentation. We were getting an equivalent unit with identical capabilities, recalled Major Robert Henderson, Australian SASR. These weren't troops we needed to train or integrate carefully. They used the same tactics, same hand signals, same patrol procedures. We literally spoke the same tactical language. The realization led to a different operational concept. Instead of absorbing New Zealand troops into Australian patrols, run them as independent patrols and coordinate operations at the squadron level. This would maintain both nations' operational independence while allowing tactical synergy through shared intelligence and coordinated timing. The concept seemed simple. The execution would prove revolutionary. When Australian and New Zealand SAS began coordinating operations in February 1968, they discovered something that military theorists had discussed but rarely seen in practice. When two forces with identical training and culture work together, they don't just add capability, they multiply it through network effects, shared situational awareness, and complementary operations that neither could execute alone. The first coordinated Australian-New Zealand SAS operation demonstrated what the alliance would achieve over the next 3 years. Operation Crown, February 1926, 1968. Objective: reconnaissance of suspected Viet Cong base area in Long High Hills. Assets: 2 Australian SAS patrols, 1 New Zealand SAS patrol. Method: coordinated insertion on 3 sides of suspected area, simultaneous reconnaissance, shared intelligence in real time via radio relay. The Australian and New Zealand patrol commanders met for 30 minutes before insertion to coordinate. They didn't need longer. Same map study procedures, same patrol planning format, same understanding of tactical priorities. The New Zealand commander, Sergeant Mike Thompson, described the planning meeting as weirdly efficient. Normally, when you coordinate with other units, there's a translation period, Thompson explained. You have to explain how you operate, what your capabilities are, how you communicate. With the Aussies, nothing to explain. They knew what we do because they do the same thing. We knew what they do because we do the same thing. Planning took 30 minutes that would have taken hours with any other unit. The 3 patrols inserted by helicopter at dawn on February 19th, 8 kilometers apart. Each patrol established observation posts overlooking approaches to the suspected base area. Then they waited. For 5 days, the patrols observed enemy movements without being detected. They documented supply routes, counted fighters, identified leadership, and shared all intelligence in real time through radio communication. The Australians observed traffic from the east. The New Zealanders observed traffic from the north. Both watched the same enemy forces move through the area and built a complete picture of enemy strength and patterns. On February 24th, the Australian patrols spotted a large enemy force moving toward the New Zealand position. They radioed warning. Thompson's patrol repositioned to observation point with better defensive position and watched the enemy force pass 200 meters away without detecting them. That evening, all three patrols coordinated an ambush plan. The New Zealand patrol would establish ambush position on a trail all three patrols had observed carrying heavy traffic. The Australian patrols would establish blocking positions to cut off enemy withdrawal routes, timing synchronized through radio communication. At 5:20 on February 25th, a Viet Cong supply column of 23 fighters moved down the trail the New Zealanders were covering. Thompson's patrol initiated ambush with claymore mines and automatic weapons fire. 17 enemy killed in the first 30 seconds. The survivors tried to withdraw east and ran into the Australian blocking position. 4 more killed. The remaining 2 escaped north through the only gap in the ambush cordon. Exactly as the patrol commanders had predicted and allowed, because a perfect cordon would have required more soldiers than they had. The ambush lasted 90 seconds, 21 enemy dead, significant supplies captured, 0 friendly casualties. The 3 patrols withdrew through planned extraction routes without enemy contact and were extracted by helicopter by noon. The entire operation, from insertion to extraction, lasted 7 days. Results: detailed intelligence on enemy base area and supply routes, 21 enemy killed in coordinated ambush, complete surprise maintained throughout, 0 friendly casualties. American commanders who reviewed the after-action report couldn't understand how 3 patrols totaling 15 soldiers had achieved what would normally require a reinforced company of 150 soldiers and probably cost 10-15 friendly casualties. The answer was coordination, enabled by identical training and culture. The Australian and New Zealand patrols could communicate complex tactical concepts with minimal radio traffic because they shared vocabulary and doctrine. They could coordinate timing precisely because they shared procedures. They could trust each other's tactical decisions because they'd been trained to make the same decisions. This wasn't 3 independent patrols in the same area. It was one distributed tactical operation executed by 3 teams who operated as extensions of each other. Over the next 6 months, Australian and New Zealand SAS refined their coordination into standard operating procedures that exploited their unique advantages. The Australians had larger numbers, better logistics, established intelligence networks, and operational infrastructure at Nui Dat. The New Zealanders had fresh perspective, eagerness to prove themselves, and slight operational differences that complemented Australian methods. Together, they developed tactics neither had used independently. The hammer and anvil became a signature move. Australian patrol would establish ambush position on a trail or near an enemy position. New Zealand patrol would conduct a reconnaissance patrol, deliberately making slightly more noise than normal, pushing enemy forces toward the Australian ambush. Enemy fighters, detecting what they thought was a clumsy patrol, would withdraw using trails they thought were safe, directly into Australian killing zones. It worked because the enemy had learned to detect and avoid normal SAS patrols, explained Corporal James Mitchell, Australian SASR. We were very good at being invisible. But the Kiwis could be deliberately slightly less invisible, just enough to push enemy movement without making them suspicious of an ambush. They'd appear to be a normal patrol the enemy could avoid, when actually they were herding the enemy toward us. The technique required extraordinary trust. The New Zealand patrol was deliberately compromising some of their stealth to serve as bait. If the coordination failed, they'd be in contact with superior enemy forces without immediate support. But the technique worked repeatedly because both nations' patrols trusted each other's tactical competence completely. The double tap, reconnaissance, became another standard procedure. Australian patrol would conduct reconnaissance of a target, establish observation post, gather intelligence. After they extracted, New Zealand patrol would insert into the same area days later and conduct follow-up reconnaissance from different position. Enemy forces often changed their behavior after detecting reconnaissance activity, even if they didn't know they'd been observed. The two-stage reconnaissance caught those behavioral changes and gave a complete picture of enemy patterns both before and after they suspected surveillance. The second patrol was actually more dangerous than the first, Thompson acknowledged. By the time we went in, the enemy was often alert that something was wrong. They'd increase security, change patrol patterns, set up counter-reconnaissance measures. But that behavior itself was intelligence. We learned what they did when they suspected observation, which helped plan future operations. The coordinated long-range ambush became the most tactically complex innovation. Multiple Australian and New Zealand patrols would establish ambush positions kilometers apart along suspected enemy supply routes. When enemy forces were detected by one patrol, that patrol would allow them to pass without engaging, tracking their movement and radioing updates to other patrols. Hours later, the enemy column would walk into an ambush by a different patrol that had been alerted and positioned based on the first patrol's intelligence. From enemy perspective, it must have seemed like we had perfect intelligence on their movements, said Henderson. They'd move supplies at night on trails they'd checked for security, and we'd ambush them kilometers away from where we'd been observing. They couldn't understand how we knew they were coming. They didn't know we had patrols coordinating across the entire province. This coordination created a surveillance and interdiction network that covered far more terrain than the number of patrols suggested. At any given time, 46 Australian and 12 New Zealand patrols were operating in Viet Cong province. That's 550 soldiers total. But through coordination and shared intelligence, those patrols created an intelligence picture and response capability that felt omnipresent to enemy forces. The enemy perspective on facing combined ANZAC SAS operations came from captured documents and post-war interviews that revealed the psychological impact. A Viet Cong after-action report from March 1968, captured during a subsequent operation, described an encounter with what was almost certainly a coordinated Australian-New Zealand operation. Our supply column departed base area at 2200 hours using approved route. Security was maintained according to procedure. At 1:40 hours, point element detected possible enemy observation position 200 meters east of trail. Column halted and sent scout element to investigate. Scout element found no enemy but noted signs of recent presence. Commander decided enemy reconnaissance had withdrawn and route was secure. Column continued. At 3:20 hours, 4 kilometers from previous detection, column was ambushed by large enemy force with automatic weapons and explosive devices. 17 comrades killed before column could withdraw. Enemy withdrew before reinforcements arrived. No bodies or equipment found. This encounter suggests enemy has multiple reconnaissance forces coordinating surveillance of our supply routes. Recommend avoiding this route and conducting security sweep before any future movements. The report revealed several things. First, the VC had detected one patrol, likely New Zealand, but not the other, likely Australian, that was actually executing the ambush. Second, they'd correctly deduced that multiple patrols were coordinating. Third, they'd recommended avoiding the entire route, meaning one ambush had interdicted an entire supply line. This was force multiplication, 2 patrols achieving strategic effect disproportionate to their numbers. Other captured documents from 1968-1970 showed similar patterns. VC units operating in Viet Cong province reported increasing difficulty predicting where SAS ambushes would occur. Routes that were secure one week would be interdicted the next. Areas that had been calm would suddenly become dangerous. Attempts to track SAS patrol patterns failed because the patrols coordinated in ways that prevented pattern recognition. We cannot develop effective countertactics because enemy reconnaissance forces appear to operate with complete intelligence on our movements, while we have no intelligence on their positions. Read one document from October 1969. Their ability to ambush our forces at unexpected times and locations suggests either numerous patrols or perfect knowledge of our plans. We have found no evidence of intelligence penetration, suggesting numerous patrols, but we detect few patrols despite increased counter-reconnaissance efforts. This contradiction creates uncertainty that affects planning and morale. The uncertainty was the point. Combined ANZAC SAS operations created an environment where enemy forces operating in Viet Cong province had to assume they were under observation at all times, had to avoid trails they'd previously used safely, and had to change patterns constantly to avoid ambushes. This disrupted logistics, complicated planning, and created perpetual stress. Post-war interviews with Viet Cong fighters who operated in Viet Cong during 1968-1971 revealed the psychological toll. We knew there were special enemy forces operating in small groups, explained a former VC platoon leader. We called them Song Ma, twin ghosts, because it seemed like there were always 2 of them watching from different directions. We detect signs of one patrol and change our route, then get ambushed by another patrol we never saw. It was like fighting enemies who could see everything while we saw nothing. The twin ghosts terminology is significant because it suggests VC forces recognized they were facing coordinated operations, even if they didn't understand the details of how Australian and New Zealand forces worked together. American commanders observing combined ANZAC SAS operations had reactions ranging from admiration to disbelief to frustration. The admiration came from recognizing tactical excellence. Captain Morrison, who'd been skeptical of the initial projections, became an advocate after watching the operations unfold. What the Australian and New Zealand SAS accomplished wasn't just good tactics, it was innovation in small unit operations, Morrison wrote in his assessment. They coordinated complex operations across large areas with minimal command overhead, achieved effects out of proportion to their numbers, and maintained operational security that prevented enemy adaptation. This is what special operations should look like. The disbelief came from comparing ANZAC SAS results to American LRRP results in similar terrain against similar enemies. American long-range patrol units were sustaining casualties of 1520 per 100 missions. ANZAC SAS were sustaining casualties of 23 per 100 missions, while killing 10 times more enemy per patrol. The disparity was hard to accept, admitted a senior American Special Operations officer in a classified assessment. Either our training was inadequate, our tactics were wrong, or we were facing a different enemy. Analysis showed we were in similar terrain against similar forces. The difference was ANZAC tactical methods. The frustration came from inability to replicate ANZAC results despite attempts to adopt their methods. American commanders who observed ANZAC operations would try to implement similar coordination between American LRRP teams, but the results were inconsistent. "We tried to do what the Australians and Kiwis did," explained a LRRP company commander. "We'd coordinate patrol positions, share intelligence, time our movements, but it never worked as smoothly. We'd have communication problems, coordination failures, patrols making different tactical decisions than we'd planned. The ANZAC patrols just flowed together naturally. Ours felt forced. The difference was cultural and training. Australian and New Zealand SAS soldiers had literally trained together, some for years before deploying to Vietnam. They'd gone through identical selection courses, studied the same tactical manuals, practiced the same patrol procedures. When they coordinated operations, they were coordinating between teams who'd already internalized the same tactical principles. American LRRP teams, even when well-trained, came from different units with different training pipelines and different operational cultures. Coordinating between them required explicit communication and detailed planning. Coordinating between ANZAC SAS patrols required minimal communication because they already knew what each other would do. It's like the difference between two people who have danced together for years versus two good dancers who just met, explained an American officer who observed both. Both pairs can dance well individually, but the pair who have danced together will anticipate each other's moves, adjust automatically, and make it look effortless. The ANZAC SAS had that kind of coordination. You couldn't replicate it just by training people to be good individually. The statistics from ANZAC SAS operations between February 1968 and November 1971 documented the effectiveness that observers found hard to believe. Combined Australian-New Zealand SAS conducted 1,847 patrols during this period. Enemy casualties: 724 confirmed killed, over 1,000 estimated wounded based on blood trails and intelligence reports. ANZAC casualties: 6 KIA, 4 Australian, 2 New Zealand, 11 WIA wounded in action. This produced a kill ratio of approximately 120, 1 in confirmed kills, or if wounded are included on both sides, roughly 100, one which matched the original projection Morrison thought was delusional. More significant than the ratio was the pattern of enemy casualties. Analysis of after-action reports showed that ANZAC ambushes averaged 8.3 enemy killed per engagement. American LRRP ambushes in similar terrain averaged 2.1 enemy killed per engagement. The difference wasn't firepower, both used similar weapons. The difference was preparation and coordination. ANZAC ambushes were typically prepared over days of observation, positioned based on detailed intelligence about enemy patterns, and often coordinated between multiple patrols to cut off withdrawal routes. American ambushes were typically opportunity engagements when patrols encountered enemy forces, initiated with less preparation and less coordination. Both were tactically sound for their objectives. But ANZAC approach produced higher enemy casualties per engagement and lower friendly casualties because the preparation minimized risk and maximized surprise. Intelligence production showed similar patterns. ANZAC SAS patrols averaged 14.3 significant intelligence reports per mission. American LRRP teams averaged 4.7 reports per mission. Again, the difference was coordination. When Australian and New Zealand patrols observed the same area from different positions, they could corroborate reports, identify patterns single patrols might miss, and provide three-dimensional intelligence picture that single patrol reconnaissance couldn't achieve. Mission duration revealed another advantage. ANZAC patrols averaged 12.4 days per mission. American LRRP teams averaged 5.1 days per mission. Longer missions meant better intelligence through extended observation, and more opportunities to conduct ambushes based on observed enemy patterns. But longer missions also meant extended time in enemy territory with no resupply, which required exceptional fieldcraft and physical endurance. The fact that ANZAC patrols routinely stayed out twice as long as American patrols, while sustaining lower casualties, suggested their tactics for remaining undetected were superior. Unintended contact rates patrols being detected and engaged by enemy when they didn't want contact provided the most revealing statistic. ANZAC SAS patrols made unintended contact 4.2% of missions. American LRRP teams made unintended contact 23.1% of missions. This difference was enormous and explained much of the casualty disparity. ANZAC patrols controlled when and where they fought. American patrols often fought when and where enemy forces detected them first. These statistics, documented in official military records and analyzed in post-war assessments, validated what observers had reported. Combined ANZAC SAS operations achieved a level of tactical effectiveness unprecedented in the Vietnam War for small unit operations. The operational culture that enabled such effective coordination between Australian and New Zealand SAS had roots in shared history and mutual respect that extended beyond military operations. Australia and New Zealand had fought together in every major conflict since World War I, Gallipoli, where ANZAC became more than an acronym but a cultural identity, the Western Front, North Africa and Greece in World War II, Korea. The relationship was deeper than normal military alliances because it was built on shared sacrifice, similar cultures, and geographic proximity that created natural affinity. Working with Kiwis wasn't like working with Americans or other allies, explained Mitchell. Not better or worse, just different. We understood their humor, their approach to problems, their attitude toward risk and authority. There was no cultural translation needed. We were basically the same people in different uniforms. This cultural affinity extended to military operations in ways that mattered tactically. Both nations' militaries had developed from British models, but adapted to circumstances where they operated with limited resources far from home support. This created military cultures that emphasized self-reliance, improvisation, and small unit excellence over reliance on overwhelming force or extensive logistics. In Vietnam, this meant ANZAC forces operated with the understanding that they'd have limited fire support, limited reinforcement, and need to succeed through skill rather than resources. The shared understanding created mutual respect and trust that enabled tactical risks neither would take with unfamiliar forces. I'd let a Kiwi patrol position as blocking force for my ambush, knowing they'd be exactly where they said they'd be, exactly when they said they'd be there, said Henderson. That level of trust is what made the coordination work. We didn't need backup plans or contingencies because we trusted each other's competence completely. The New Zealand perspective echoed this trust. We were the smaller force, Thompson acknowledged. One troop versus Australian squadron. We could have been treated as junior partners or supporting element. Instead, the Aussies treated us as equals, listened to our ideas, and gave us operational independence while coordinating at the strategic level. That respect made us want to prove we deserved it. The social relationships reinforced the operational ones. Australian and New Zealand SAS soldiers shared the same bases, ate at the same mess, drank at the same bars. They played rugby together, told stories, established friendships that extended beyond professional relationships. When operations went badly and soldiers died, both nations mourned together. When operations succeeded, both celebrated together. This social cohesion created operational cohesion that formal coordination mechanisms couldn't replicate. The lack of rivalry despite obvious similarities was notable. In military forces, elite units often compete for resources, prestige, and recognition. Australian and New Zealand SAS could have competed over who got the most dangerous missions, who achieved the highest kill ratios, who deserved more credit. Instead, they collaborated. There was no keeping score, Mitchell explained. We weren't trying to outdo each other. We were trying to accomplish the mission together. If a New Zealand patrol got a good ambush, we celebrated with them. If an Australian patrol got the intelligence that set up the ambush, they credited the Kiwis for executing it. No ego. Just professionals supporting each other. The legacy of combined ANZAC SAS operations in Vietnam extended well beyond the immediate tactical results. For Australian and New Zealand militaries, it validated the value of small, highly trained special operations forces over large conventional forces for counterinsurgency operations. Both nations expanded their SAS units after Vietnam and made special operations a priority in defense planning. For special operations globally, it provided a model for multinational coordination between forces with compatible training and culture. Modern special operations coalitions, where multiple nations' forces operate together under coordinated command, draw lessons from how Australian and New Zealand SAS coordinated in Vietnam. For understanding military effectiveness, it demonstrated that shared culture and training enable coordination that formal command structures can't replicate. The most effective military partnerships aren't created through treaties and agreements, but through shared experiences, compatible cultures, and mutual trust built over years. For the Vietnam War specifically, it showed that tactical excellence at small unit level could achieve strategic effects, even in a war that would be lost at the political and strategic level. ANZAC SAS didn't win the Vietnam War, but in Phuoc Thai Province between 1968 and 1971, they achieved complete tactical dominance through coordination that neither nation could have achieved operating independently. The soldiers who served in combined ANZAC SAS operations carried the experience into their post-military lives. Many maintained friendships across the Tasman Sea decades after the war ended. They attended each other's reunions, corresponded regularly, and passed stories to younger generations about what they'd accomplished together. Vietnam was hard, Thompson said in a 2015 interview. Lost mates saw things I wish I hadn't, came home to protests and indifference. But operating with the Aussies, that was professional satisfaction. We were so good together, so in sync, so effective. That's something I'm proud of regardless of how the war turned out. Henderson's perspective echoed this pride. We were given an impossible task: control a province with a handful of soldiers against an enemy that outnumbered us 50-1 and knew the terrain better than we did. And we did it, not alone but with the Kiwis. Together we were unstoppable. That's not arrogance, that's just fact. The numbers prove it. The numbers do prove it. Between February 1968 and November 1971, combined ANZAC SAS operations killed or wounded approximately 1,700 enemy fighters while sustaining 17 casualties. They gathered intelligence that enabled larger operations, interdicted supply routes that starved enemy units of resources, and created psychological pressure that degraded enemy effectiveness across an entire province. They did this with forces that never exceeded 160 soldiers at any given time. This wasn't just an alliance. It was, as Captain Morrison finally acknowledged, overkill. The perfect kind of overkill where tactical excellence, multiplied through coordination between compatible forces, achieved results that seemed impossible until they were documented and couldn't be denied. The Australian and New Zealand SAS proved that when you pair good with good and give them identical training, compatible culture, and mutual trust, you don't create something twice as good. You create something exponentially better. Something that enemies can't counter because they're facing not just skilled soldiers, but coordinated excellence that anticipates, adapts, and executes at levels that normally require much larger forces. That's the legacy of ANZAC SAS operations in Vietnam. Not that they won the war, but that they demonstrated what special operations forces can achieve when everything aligns. Training, culture, coordination, mutual respect, and tactical excellence. For the Viet Cong who faced them, it was the nightmare of fighting twin ghosts who saw everything while remaining invisible. For the Americans who observed them, it was the lesson that tactical excellence matters more than numbers or firepower. For the Australians and New Zealanders who served together, it was proof that when brothers in arms truly operate as brothers, not just allies, they become unstoppable. This wasn't an alliance. It was overkill, the perfect kind.